Final speaker before we get to the break first and Q&A second is our own Prentice Cox. So you've already heard some of this, so I'll say this part quickly and then I'll say the part a little more slowly that you haven't heard. Professor of Law, University of Minnesota Law School, as a former assistant AG, prosecuted nationally recognized cases involving subprime mortgage lending, foreclosure, banking regulation, and consumer fraud, drafted numerous consumer protection statutes and rules, served as a consultant for state and federal agencies for developing nations, graduate of Oberlin College, and as Bill mentioned, the University of Minnesota Law School. He lives in Minneapolis with his witty wife, Marissa, and a semi-well-behaved dog, and has 3 children ranging in age and temperament. I told you dogs are going to be a thing.
Jack may be right that this is the most important conference of the year. I think it's the most elucidating conference we've had in the law school in a long time, but I'm absolutely certain it's the most entertaining. And it's a conference that was co-organized with my new friend Jordan Berry and excuse me, the USC Gould Law School. I'm a consumer protection lawyer, so I'll start out with a disclosure. My wife that I mentioned is a class counsel on the Merle case, the original and biggest of the 2 class actions that led to the NAR settlement. All right, I think Rob may be right, and I think Anna may be right. I think they're both plausible, somewhere north of plausible and somewhere south of probable. But I don't think it's really the question we have today. This, even though it's the title that I wrote for the forum, this is not about whether the NAR settlement solves the problem, because no single civil lawsuit will prevent the recreation of new forms of market collusion. It just can't. The judge in the case is obligated to narrowly tailor the injunction to, particularly in a private suit, to solve the problem that underlied the claim in the lawsuit. And I think this one does that remarkably well. And that's all it could do. And it does it better than almost any other class action settlement that I've seen. So I think the question here is cases like this that attack market-wide problems, I've always said lie on a continuum between a case that's about the case outcome and a case that's about exposing the market corruption. And I think the NAR settlement lies definitely in the middle of that continuum. And I think in the long run, its effect is more about exposing the market corruption. We're here today because of the NAR settlement. If we had held this seminar just a year ago, but particularly 5 years ago, there would be 6 people in the room, and they would be because they were students hoping I would write them a recommendation. All right. So, and now we've got 400 people online, including dozens and dozens of federal and state regulators and really people who should be listening to this. And that's because of the NAR settlement. It's not the last step, it's the first step. It's not the solution, it's the first step in attacking this problem. And it's been spectacularly successful at being a first step. So now I'm going to talk about 2 things. One, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about all the different players and the role they have in the future to see if we can create a fair and open real estate market for all the reasons that the other speakers have indicated. And I'm going to focus on state civil law enforcement. And then I'm going to look at some industries that have also gone through disruption in the past and try to find lessons from those disrupted industries for what we're facing today. Well, you got to start with the federal antitrust authorities. I worked for a hot minute 35 years ago for the FTC antitrust division. And so I know that they tend to split with the DOJ industry. So this has been a DOJ thing and FTC does other stuff. I think this is, for the reasons that Jack said, a big enough problem that requires the supervision level that I would love to see it at both the DOJ and the FTC took different aspects of this problem and joined together and worked on it. Now, the DOJ doesn't have a great track record here, and it's almost surely for reasons that have nothing to do with people in charge of the DOJ at the moment. But I think it would be incredible to have the DOJ and the FTC send a signal that they're going to be relentless and that they understand that this is step one and not a solution to the problem. And if you want to go all the way to the end of the world, how about a criminal antitrust action and hauling some people off in orange jumpsuits? I think that tends to get the attention of the industry much better than anything else. The second is home sellers and buyers, but I think that the other panelists have covered that topic. The only thing, I think Anna covered that topic quite well. The only thing I would add to that is if you're a buyer, consider whether you really need a buyer broker. In a world where you find all the properties yourself, typically, I've talked to students who are buying homes and they're like, why did I pay that buyer broker? I'm like, exactly. It's like, I found the home online and it's like, you probably don't need a buyer broker. You might need expert help. But you can find that with a lot of different types of professionals for a lot less. Notably, buyer brokers are a rarity in much of the rest of the world. One of the most important parts you can take away from all of this is not only do we pay twice as much as the rest of the world, but the idea of having 1.5% of your working population be realtors is absurd. It's a tiny fraction of that. My friend Doug did the numbers, and I think in the UK, it's like 1/20th of that. So I don't think we really need to have buyer brokers as a substantial element of the market. Okay, now let's talk about what I promised I'd focus on, which is state civil law enforcement. And I think here is the sleeper tool for ensuring a fair market in the future. Start with state real estate regulators. Jack's rolling his eyes, and for good reason. State real estate regulators have shown zero capacity to date that I've seen. And you can send me hate emails and tell me where I'm wrong, because I'd like to know if I'm wrong. I'd like to know if state real estate regulators have ever brought a case that involves systemic real estate conduct by the industry. But that doesn't mean they can't. Most of them have all the legal authority they need to remedy the problems we've talked about today. And many of them, at least theoretically, I'm so sorry, at least theoretically have structural independence from the real estate brokerage industry. So I think all it takes is a couple of state real estate regulators who are like, wow, I see this, and scour their own laws and think about how they can bring cases. Now, in the case that you don't think that's going to happen, we have state AG. So I would like to focus on that as a former state assistant attorney general and current special assistant attorney general. They have overlapping consumer protection authority in most cases and antitrust authority. And they have the pro-consumer culture in almost all cases and the expertise to do the job. They just haven't focused on the industry till now. When you're working in a state AG office, you've got the used car dealer today, you've got the subprime mortgage lender tomorrow, and to try to put the real estate in, let's put the real estate industry on the agenda for the first time in a big way in the state AG world, because it's a treasure trove of possible enforcement work. I'm just going to give you a few examples, but if you've got a week and a half, come over to my house and I'll bring my friend Doug Miller and my wife, and we'll sit around and give you enforcement ideas. It's pretty much endless. Let's start with buyer broker steering. It doesn't make it lawful just because it's not done on the MLS. Okay? It's blatantly unlawful to do what you've seen for people who have the obligations they have. State regulators could go after buyer brokers recommending or showing properties, disproportionately recommending or showing properties that only have certain buyer commissions attached to them. Buyer agent commissions attached to them. All that data is subpoenable. You can find it. You look at someone's last 200 deals and they never showed a house that wasn't at 3%. This is not the world's most difficult case. And if you bring these cases, the other agents get the point, okay? That this wasn't a one-time event that's going to go away. Form contracts. Thank you for bringing that up, Rob. The form contracts themselves are created by local realtor associations by and large. That in itself should be a giant red antitrust flag, because these contracts, not only the buyer broker and seller broker contracts, but the purchase agreements that are created by realtors have provisions in them that shockingly support the compensation and the interests of realtors. I'll just give you one small example from our local contract. If you sign the realtor form, which almost everybody has to for a reason I'll say in 1 second, if you sign the realtor form, you actually also are going to be signing very, very likely a related contract to agree to arbitration, and all the consumer advocates in the world shudder when they hear the words, don't sign that, right? So, but almost everybody does, right? That arbitration agreement says it's only effective if not only the buyer and the seller, but all the realtors to the transaction are part of that arbitration agreement, and it has a class action waiver. Why in the world would a seller or a buyer who even wants to go to pre-dispute arbitration, which is almost no informed buyer and seller, but this is a technical thing most wouldn't know, they sign it. Why would a buyer and seller need a class action waiver? This is the real estate industry writing into the purchase agreement documents, LOI documents, an anti-competitive provision that benefits solely them. Okay, next, misrepresentations. Well, next, I want to say, how are these contracts formed? A seller's agent telling a buyer represented by an attorney that they won't give an offer to a seller unless it's on the realtor approved form. It happens all the time. I won't show my buyer this. I have to use my realtor form. Okay, again, why would a fiduciary say that, right? And that's actionable. Misrepresentations in the formation of the broker contract. So we focus a little on the broker contract, but this is meat and potatoes. This is standard AG, UDAP kind of work, unfair and deceptive acts and practices. If Rob's right and realtors will enter private deals for commission splitting, think about what that means for the negotiation of the contract between the seller and the seller's agent. Here, I don't have to pay 6% anymore. Well, there's lots of responses to this question, and almost all of them will be deceptive, except for the truth, which is, well, our agency has set that as policy. So if you go with us, you're going to pay 6%. You can go somewhere else and pay a lot less, but that's how we do it to maintain our commission rates. Most realtors are not going to respond like that. And you're going to get a lot of deceptive responses like, I have to charge you 6%, but it's because it's required to pay the buyer's agent. That would be untrue and actionable. Oral representations to sellers and buyers in contract formation. A buyer's agent saying, I work for free. That's absolutely not true in the world that is post-NAR settlement. Deceptive practices in the conduct of the contract formation. And this is a scenario that is quite common in our local real estate industry, and I bet it happens other places. A buyer broker determines a buyer's preferences and needs for a home purchase, identifies potential properties, shows properties, and advises about the offer terms on the purchase agreement, and then wraps a buyer-broker agreement into the purchase agreement documents that are submitted electronically. So when you're making your first purchase agreement offer, you're also agreeing to a buyer-broker contract, which may include an exclusive representation period tying you to that buyer's agent for 6 months or even longer, okay? That's a deceptive practice. All of these things are actionable. One last in this endless list of examples, I'll give you one more. Seller agent refusals to deal with non-realtors. Sellers agents tell potential buyers that they won't show the home unless they have a buyer's agent. Now, this is increasingly important as the likely best practice is to move away from buyer's agents toward non-realtors providing that service at a lower price. All right, so what sources of law do you have here? Well, experienced public enforcers, of which there are many online, and, excuse me, we'll look at this and go, wow, there's a lot of UDAP claims in there, and everyone will see a lot of antitrust claims throughout all the talks that we've given today. But a couple more that have been mentioned, but aren't the typical things state attorney generals bring, is fiduciary duty. If you start looking through all of these problems through the lens of fiduciary duties, which in most states the realtors are, they are fiduciaries, these claims get really easy to prove. No longer do you have like material omissions. You have strict duties of loyalty, strict duties of disclosure that don't exist in an arm's length transaction, which makes these cases much more viable and much easier to prove. Secondly, those real estate licensing schemes, sometimes they're enforceable by AGs, and they can include tremendous rules and much more easily enforceable practices. For instance, in Minnesota, Section 82.81 includes in a list of prohibited practices by realtors engaging in an anti-competitive activity. So our real estate agency has the authority to enforce as a licensing matter all these anti-competitive activities we've talked about. The authority is there. I could go on for days about all the conduct that you could look at. This area is ripe for state public enforcement civil lawsuits. If you take a step back and you start to see the possibility of that state action, what we may see is the real estate market segregates by state based on the involvement and the effectiveness of the state regulators. And that's not necessarily a bad outcome. It gives alternative business models a place to flourish and provides a basis for comparing those outcomes to a collusion-ridden market. We see other examples of this all the time. In my work, I've seen payday lending change. Thank you, Hannah. I've seen payday lending change when one state adopts a type of regulation and that goes to other states. So if we can create a fair and open market in some states, we can show the model that then other states will be able to adopt. All right, real quickly, so most of this is mentioned by others. Lenders, Housing Wire just had a headline, find buyers before agents. Mortgage industry reacts to the settlement. There's all kinds of professions that should be looking to take some of this collusion price out of the market. Attorneys, law students, if there are any of you here, it's a great way to do well by doing good. When can you say you can hire me as attorney for the fraction of the cost of an alternative professional? But here it is. And their attorneys are trained in fiduciary duty and take it seriously. Finally, realtors, there are probably realtors in the audience going, oh, I hate all you people. I don't do that. Well, my response to that is, good, this is your moment. Promote it. Right? If there's realtors out there that don't do these things, then you have to figure out how to promote it, and you have to figure out how to get business out of doing that, and you'll do yourself, not only yourself a favor, but you'll do the market a favor. And there are way too many part-time realtors, as we've covered. And this is the opportunity to gain a market advantage that you should have by being a transparent and effective realtor who provides a good service. All right, real quickly, let's compare to other markets. Travel agents is the classic internet disruption story, but any internet disruption story, there's a lot to learn from here, particularly on the buyer side. However, it's also not a great analogy because the need for expert help is different between buying a ticket to LA and buying a home. So I don't think that that gets us all the way there, or even most of the way there. Somebody has mentioned subprime mortgages as an example. I'm super involved in that. Yeah, good analogy in a pessimistic way. The public enforcement lawsuits, of which I was in the leadership of or led many, exposed the problem, and the industry kept adapting after each lawsuit and kept the scam going for almost a decade. And that difference, that decade, led to a global financial crisis. Okay, our inability to shut that off in 1998 rather than in 2007. Now we're seeing new products on the market that are bringing back subprime mortgages with a fintech edge, which is a lesson again about the need to stay on it, put some people in orange jumpsuits to put the fear of God into people to not do this stuff, right? And the more you can stay on a regulatory system, you can get that result. I think the best analogy, are you ready for this? And this goes to Rob, your notorious Rob, this is why you're not alone for once, right? I think the best analogy is the tobacco industry. So bear with me for a minute. The industry managed for decades, sound familiar, to beat back all attempts at holding it accountable for countless human suffering until the 1990s AG settlements imposed, again, was a fantastic case outcome, imposed, billion-dollar relief, but also a substantial injunction. Okay, but it didn't solve the problem, but it beat it back a long way. And if we're at that moment in the real estate industry, then I think the combined federal and state efforts to better regulate and to create an open market and discourage collusion puts us at that post-1990s tobacco settlement moment, which I think state and federal regulators did rise to that moment. But again, a warning. Thanks, Hannah. Again, a warning. Everyone's eyes were off the ball, and vaping came in the form, once again, of a high-tech product that's different. And we have junior high students by the hundreds of thousands using tobacco again. Okay, it came back. It's always going to come back, and we've got to stop that. Finally, the analogy is surprisingly close when you look at how tobacco leaned into racial justice language to oppose effectively stop legislation to get rid of menthol cigarettes. If you want more on this, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council is a superb website on all of these things. And that's exactly the most effective talking point of the industry right now. You know, you're hurting minority buyers. Let's not let that we'll talk about that in Q&A. Wilfried is an expert on this, and we'll hear from him. Let's not let that cynical ploy work, okay? Thank you, Claire. We're done with all the speakers. We have some refreshments out there. What do we got for time? We'll be back we're 5 minutes late, which isn't too bad, given all the tech issues, but not the result of Randy and Jason, mostly my result. We'll be back at 10 minutes, which is 2:35. So thank you.